Awesome. Okay, so Sarah Wheeler, PhD, sounds like a TV show, right? Tuesday nights on
Really
Fox.
boring one.
So I often talk about on this podcast how it was the pandemic and lockdown that really was the catalyst to my own personal implosion, and my meltdown that led to my ADHD diagnosis. I also like to joke that none of us ever came to our ADHD diagnosis because we were like, everything's going great. My life is wonderful. I needed a name for this superpower. But you kind of you were diagnosed literally a week before lockdown, right? In 2020?
I got in there right at the last minute.
So this was not pandemic related. So what was going on that led you to kind of start connecting the dots and think I should look into it? It was a friend of yours, right?
Yeah. I had, I've always been like this. But no one ever quite knew what to call it. And, I think it was motherhood in if I'm going to put one finger on it. The psychiatrist who assessed me talked about it's pretty common that there's one event that kind of is the straw that broke the camel's back for someone with ADHD, especially someone who's been compensating for a long time. So it might not just be that motherhood is hard and everyone's struggling, but this could be the thing that really made it impossible for you to continue to function as an ADHD person. So, I think, motherhood just really rocked my emotional regulation, which I realized was pretty delicate, or at least, involving a lot of constant management that I wasn't able to do anymore. And I wasn't depressed. I wasn't anxious. I've been depressed and anxious before, clinically in my teens and 20s. It wasn't that. But I was really struggling with emotional regulation. And I was kind of in that place with kids where I had two kids. The younger one was kind of sleeping. I was more like a human being in the world of humans. And I just was kind of looking at what I wanted to do work-wise and feeling like, why do I have all these ambitions and so much incompetence? How can I be I know I'm smart and there's things I want to do and sometimes I'm really good at doing them. And how come I just can't get it together? And also recognizing this is something that's always been there. It's just at kind of a pitch that's untenable right now. And then, like you said, my friend Sarah, another Sarah, but without an H, so we know that's a totally different demographic. She is maybe the smartest, funniest person I know. Really just an incredible mind. And she had recently gotten diagnosed with ADHD and just so many things were kind of clicking into place for her. And she's also a very blunt person, which I really appreciate. She tells you the truth. And so I would be talking to her about these issues over and over. Why can't I just get it together? Or, I have all these plans 1 week and then they just disappear the next week, or I start kind of doubting them, or I just can't get started, classic kind of things. And she was like, it's because you have ADHD and you need to do something about that. So I finally was just to get her off my back, I was like, all right, I'll make an appointment for an evaluation. And then Sarah can stop harassing me about how I have ADHD. I know I don't have ADHD. I'm good at school. I have a PhD, as you mentioned at the top. I have good relationships. I've been working with people with ADHD at that point for over a decade, and I really felt like I understood it. So I did it kind of to humor Sarah, and then the evaluation, which was short, maybe 20 minutes, kind of in that 20 minutes that the doctor was deciding I had ADHD, I too went along that process, and by the time it was done, I was convinced, mostly because of the questions he asked me were so different from the things that I thought about people with ADHD being like, all the little boys I'd worked with, and the recognition for me, and, things even stupid things like, do you start things without reading the directions? And, I was like, yeah, wait, is this what we're doing? Are we asking these questions? Because that's not, those aren't the things that I'm like, well, doesn't everyone have that? Or that I associate with ADHD. So yeah, so I got that diagnosis, like, I think on a Tuesday, and then Friday was school's canceled. We're going to be in our homes for a little while. And that's how it all got rolling.
So let this new identity just marinate in the wasp's nest of your home for the next few months, right?
Totally. Yeah, I was like, I had about 48 hours to be like so in my feelings about it. And I described in an essay I wrote about it, like coming down from like the upstairs where I'd had this, this appointment with the psychiatrist that was virtual, and asking my husband kind of the questions that the psychiatrist had asked me. Like, I was kind of in shock, and I was like, do I not read the directions? Do I like not finish things? And do I like interrupt a lot? And he kind of thought I was joking. He was like, yeah, you know this stuff about yourself, but I don't think I really did in that way. So I got to kind of be shocked for a few minutes, and right then I had to parent 2 small children in an apartment for 2 years.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, so many of us had that similar experience of like, I don't know what you're talking about. First of all, I'm not hyperactive, and, not identifying with the idea of hyperactivity. And then at the same time, like realizing, like, I wish I could have a surveillance video of my diagnosis appointment with my own GP, because I was like, I showed up with all the paperwork because I had printed out all these self-tests because I was worried I was going to forget what to talk about. And so I had all these self-tests and checklists, and I like
Good
showed
strategy.
up, and I'm like fumbling with all this paperwork in front of her. And it was the same thing. She would ask me questions, and I would like immediately start launching into my life story with every question. And then, the same idea where I was like, I'm not hyperactive. But then she would ask me questions like, do you have a hard time? Like, how do you feel when you're stuck in traffic? And I was like, I want to rip my steering wheel out of the dashboard and throw it out the window. And I'm like, oh, okay, I see where we're going with this.
That's so funny. I did have a moment, a small epiphany, talking with my women's group about the Enneagram. And I don't know if our listeners or you, Katie, are into the Enneagram. I find these things are always kind of fun to play around with. So the Enneagram 7 is kind of like the ADHD type. And I was like, I'm not a 7. I'm a 4. I'm an artist. I'm a brooding artist. And there was another woman in the group who was very much a 7 and very kind of classically seem like ADHD. And she was talking about this question that you ask people to kind of help determine their Enneagram, which is if you're behind someone in traffic and there's a left-hand turn light and they can go and they decide to stop and you're behind them, what are you thinking? And she said she's thinking like, I have so much stuff to do. And I was like, oh my God, yeah, that's the only thing to think.
Right.
So that was a moment I was like, maybe I'm a 7. That was before I got my diagnosis and was helpful. But the other thing about hyperactivity that I learned that was really helpful for me is the way that it presents differently for girls and women. So it's not just that, I mean, yeah, statistically, girls do tend to at least get diagnosed more with the spacey ADHD. That is more kind of internalizing and not be hyperactive, but also hyperactivity is talking a lot. It's having a lot of thoughts rapidly racing in your head. It's waking up first thing in the morning with a song that you have to sing out loud, which happens to me, more days than not. So that kind of changed my perception too. And it helped me in the diagnoses that I make of children, that hyperactivity can exist for girls, but it usually doesn't look like fidgeting or, bouncing off the walls.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And and I think a lot of us just didn't realize that that's not what everybody's experience is, right? And I still sort of feel like there is a part of me that is still kind of gaslights myself a lot of the time, where I'm like, totally. this is just what everybody goes through, right? Like there's nothing abnormal about having, not only one song, but then also like the other one that's in the background that's like, and all of those contrast. Sort of Right, exactly. Or like trying to harmonize with myself in the shower. So I'm like trying to sing two pitches at once. And I was trying to explain this to my husband once where I'm like, do you ever try to do that where you're trying to harmonize with yourself while singing a song? And he would look to me like I was insane. And I was like, oh, I've said too much. But yeah,
Go onto your ADHD Facebook group for that. Let your husband be.
Yeah, and I think it's only through talking to so many women at this point who were diagnosed in adulthood, who were, really good in school and had really high expectations with themselves and really pushed themselves and really got through white knuckling it their whole, through most of their adult life, and then have gotten to this point now where it's like, we're just a ball of anxiety, right? And so it makes so much sense to me that so many of us are diagnosed with depression and anxiety at some point in our adult life. And I still can't decide if these are how I feel about the term comorbidities, which I actually am curious with you as an educational psychologist. What are your thoughts on this idea that there's comorbidities? Because for me, I'm at this phase where I'm like, everything feels like just trauma from being undiagnosed, I don't know if, so women who are I've talked to women who are diagnosed with ADHD and bipolar or ADHD and OCD, where I'm like, is it true? Like, is this even possible? I feel like I'm constantly trying to figure all of that out, how that operates. But anyway, I don't know where that tangent came from, but go ahead.
Me too. It came from your beautiful brain. I first of all, just the term comorbidity. It's like the language that we use in the world of diagnostics is so behind, the world of neurodiversity and like what people actually want to be talking about when they talk about brains. But I think there is true coexistence that's somewhat unrelated. But you can never really prove that. Like I see kids all the time who have learning disabilities and anxiety, or learning disabilities and ADHD. And it's like, just like you said, it's like, yeah. So you're telling me that they don't pay attention? Well, learning is hard. And sometimes you can, if you do a thorough assessment, you can get at the root of that. That's why, I hate except in circumstances where it's just kind of the means to an end and you already know that someone has ADHD. For kids, I really don't like the go to your pediatrician, fill out a questionnaire, bam, you have an ADHD diagnosis, because so many things can look like ADHD. And a kid could not be paying attention, because they're really struggling with the learning concepts, things like that. But you can talk yourself, and I do as a psychologist because I like to talk, but also because I think this stuff is tricky and it's so culturally constructed. You can talk yourself into circles about, whether what's the chicken or egg with comorbidity, right? Like you said, but really what the point is that's helpful for people is like, what would we do differently if we knew these things were related or not? And that I find helpful is like, okay, if somebody is showing depression and they're showing ADHD, is it helpful to think about them as related? I would think so. And think about, how do we treat them together? Or what if we focus on one, would we expect to see the other one to feel, less difficult, rather than like, let's just, treat them as separate things is usually not so helpful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I find I talk myself in circles all the time I literally, I feel like I've been doing nothing but living and breathing ADHD since my diagnosis and with this podcast. And I do not feel any clearer in my idea of like what it even is we're talking about. And I think that's what I related so much to the essay that you wrote a year into your diagnosis, Call Me by My Name, where you were kind of reflecting on this journey of being diagnosed and your own sort of internalized ableism and, how we've a lot of the time it feels like we're pathologizing lovely children or lovely people who are just weird and wonderful and unable to conform in certain harsh environments like school and the workplace. But anyway, I think, what was really like I feel so often like, what are we even talking about when we talk about ADHD? Yeah. Are we talking about the traits of difficulty, the struggle, the evidence of struggle throughout your entire life, what a lot of psychologists are looking for, which is like, what's the lifelong evidence of this being an impediment, versus are we talking about, and is that something that you can manage and treat and heal, so to speak? Or are we talking about neurodivergent brains that have this sort of, ebbs and flows when it comes to environments where we thrive versus environments like new motherhood and middle school and, all these other college where like we can't flourish and we really, really struggle and we think, and we don't know why. So I'm curious, like with all of your background, working especially with children, like what are we even talking about? What are you talking about when you talk about ADHD?
Well, I struggle with that too. I do think that, there is a distinction between, and I see this in, I'm sure you do too, in the kind of social forums that I'm a part of. There are people, for example, ADHDers who really are suffering. They really, they might value some things about their ADHD, but it's really daily a source of pain for them, and really, really keeping them from having a happy life. I wouldn't characterize myself that way. And I had some kind of imposter syndrome about having an ADHD diagnosis, which is the thing I think, if I have ADHD, it has made me feel like an imposter also in other situations. So it's kind of funny.
I always say that a pretty good indication of you having ADHD is chronic self-doubt about the ADHD.
Exactly. It's like, oh, well, no, someone else. Yeah. So, but then there's people like, me, where I think more like you said, the traits and the characteristics are really valuable to understand. And I think you're seeing this conversation in the world of autism a lot, that autistics are saying like, yeah, we do have a lot in common, but there's kind of what people are talking about, like profound autism, that like, we still want to value people and there's positives to that, but where people like really, are going to need substantial support. And then there's autistics who feel like most of what I need could happen if the environment was just a little bit more flexible to who I am. So I see that in my diagnostics, and I talk a lot with my colleagues about like, who do we give diagnosis, who don't we? The DSM, requires you, in order to have ADHD, you have to be impaired by it, according to the DSM, because they think it's a disorder. And so there are psychologists, I heard some on a podcast the other day, and it kind of pissed me off, who really don't give ADHD diagnosis to, someone who has a B+ average in college. And they even kind of, there's snarkiness around like, ha. And then they told me that they get A's and B's. And I was like, get out of my office, you imposter. And, and I understand that. I get how, research becomes complicated if, you start broadening the category. But I also think, you don't know what's going on inside someone's head. You don't know what they are doing to compensate and what is getting them to the place where they look like they're functioning. You don't know what somebody's potential is. So just to say like, oh, you don't get into driving accidents and you have a successful marriage, you don't have ADHD. It's discounting personal experience. And so when I do assessments, I always, even for the little kids, I really want to get as much as possible understanding what their process is internally, because especially with girls or other compensators, it's not always matching up to what people see. So I think it's unkind and also often inaccurate to refuse to diagnose people if they don't show a certain level of impairment. And, you have to acknowledge that people are compensating and that the impact of that will often be positive in the short run, but sometimes in the long run, it's really damaging for people.
Right. And you just sort of end up in this logical or, what's like an illogical loop where it's like, well, you
Totally.
weren't diagnosed as a child, so you can't possibly have it as an adult. And yet at the same time being like, well, I was, white knuckling it through my childhood, and now here we are. And the question is like, at what cost was I getting those A's? Yeah.
Yeah. And they've changed that. They've changed even the folks who designed the DSM, who I don't think talk about ADHD the way that we do on this podcast. They've changed some of those rules to make it so that, even for a childhood diagnosis, symptoms don't have to present before age 7. And for adult diagnoses, they can come on later as well. Because there are, like, my psychiatrist said, there are these inciting incidents that really tip the scales for people.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly asked that question a lot when I was first diagnosed, asked that question of myself, which was like, how much am I struggling? How much did I struggle in various times of my life too? And, I remember like thinking, now I'll see some I'll see some local mom and she'll be having, I could just pick people out now where I'm like, oh yeah, Jane, she's a hot mess. I bet she has ADHD. And then I'm like, oh, wait, that's how people probably see me, right? I'm like, you have that moment of that reality check where I'm like, oh yeah, that's pretty much how I present to other people. But
what these diagnoses tell us, I mean, us in our late diagnoses, I don't know if you'd agree with me, is like, we don't really know how people see us, especially if we have a lot of successful skills. We've been able to like look okay to a lot of people. And, if we're not the kids who got, I'm not the kid who got sent to the principal's office all the time. And, that probably has to do somewhat with, how I look and present too, and not just my personality. But, that was kind of what was so intense too about the diagnosis, was like, I didn't know people saw me this way. And some of the conversations realizing that were very simple, like the one with my husband of like, wait, I've known you for 20 years and you've never told me this? Well, I didn't think to.
The example that you gave in your essay.
The world.
Well, the example you gave in your essay about the how you rip open bags, where he was just like, there's something where your husband was like, I just thought it was cute.
Yeah, right. That you just kind of find wherever it's easiest to just smash it open and then spill it out.
Now I'm curious, getting back to the essay that you wrote a year into your diagnosis. So it's been a year, more than a year since you've written it. And I'm curious, has anything changed for you? Because, there was, I think it seemed to me from that, you said something in the essay where you said, diagnosis is both life-changing and inconsequential. And for me, I relate to that, but I don't know if I could elaborate on that. Can you elaborate on what that means?
Sure. I have so many like drafts of that essay that went into every little point for way longer than anyone cared to read. Maybe I'll do like the director's cut for all the ADHDers who are interested in the content and also can indulge my tangents. But I would love to elaborate. I love when people ask me that. Whenever anyone's like, say more, I'm like, how long do you have? So, I mean, I think it's inconsequential. What I meant was like, you're like, well, I'm still me, I'm still me. Like no one really cares. Not in like a bad way, but like, my ADHD people I have found now care, but like my husband doesn't care if I'm ADHD or not. He wants to know, how to communicate with me on like a more specific level than whatever my label is. Although he does show me all the ADHD TikToks. That's very sweet of him because I'm not on TikTok. He's like, baby, look at what the ADHDers are doing to find things in the fridge. It's very cute. And he is not ADHD. Here's the like, oh, is everyone this way? I'm like, not you. So in that way, it felt inconsequential. Like, you just wake up the next day and you're still you and you've always been you. And then the life-changing, I think is for many people and for me pointing towards some interventions, I guess. Although I think for me, a lot of what's changed, and what's changed even in the year since I wrote that, is just around like kind of understanding myself better. I mean, I did try meds for a little while. I took some Wellbutrin, and then I forgot to take it a lot, as I'm sure many of our listeners can relate to. And then I was like, well, if I'm not really taking it all the time and I'm not really noticing a difference, does it matter? But I just kind of started to think about myself in a different way, and structure my life in a slightly different way. That is not always successful. But that did feel consequential, you know, that I've started to think more about like really understanding what I'm good at and what I am bad at / hate, and trying to like set up, you know, my professional life to be like, what if I just like mostly didn't do the things that I hate? Could I do the kinds of work where like I just get to be, you know, me at my smartest most of the time, and then that other shit, you know, someone else does. I'm trying. There's varied success, but so things like that have felt consequential. I've worked on my self-regulation a lot, mostly around parenting, and it's not always successful. I have a lot of like, I really get angry with my kids, and I really lose it.
How old are they?
I really like. They're 4 and 6.
Oh yeah, that's still, you're still in the thick.
Yeah, I'm in it, as they say. I still wake up every night. So sorry for the mamas of younger kids. Like sometimes it gets better, sometimes it doesn't. But I really mirror my kids. And a friend of mine, Chris Martin, who is a writer and writes about, you know, his neurodivergence, wrote something about like that empathy, that extreme empathy of like, part of that is a gift. And part of it is like when your kids get upset, you're like really taking it on. So that's something that happens to me a lot. And it was really helpful for me to frame it the way that Chris did, as like, this is like sensitivity. And it's not like, I'm not an angry person. I'm not a bad person, but if I can reduce my sensitivity to this, if I can, you know, learn how to slow things down a little bit, if I can be kinder to myself, take little breaks from all the overwhelm, maybe it'll get a little easier. And it's gotten a little easier, which is measurable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, it is so hard with parenting because children are just, you know, they shit all over any sense of like serenity, right? Like you really are like in it. So, I mean, there's only so much you can do to regulate your environment when children exist. So, but you know, I love the idea, you know, of just, so I feel like so much of this diagnosis, and even the term diagnosis, I'm starting to move away from, right? I had a guest who she had a dual diagnosis of ADHD and autism, and she was talking about the identity, you know, that this is really about how you identify and being able to kind of reframe your self-concept and kind of how you are able to look at why you do why you do what you do, and to not feel, you know, that there's anything wrong with you. Right. And it's like, when you say these things out loud, it feels so oversimplified, but I think really like at the core of this identity is just recognizing that you not only are you amazing at a lot of things, but you're going to only focus on the things you suck at because it's more interesting to you, right? And how that like affects your sense of identity so much because it's more interesting to think about all the things you suck at. And so like, it's like,
and our brains do that.
Right. Yeah. Cause it's, and so I'm like, for me, it's like building this muscle to start recognizing and acknowledging and accepting what I am good at. I remember you talked about the bus trips that you take with your 4-year-old. And that sense of like novelty and adventure and how you miss that, like, just, that was like the, you know, what you're so great at as a parent. Right. And it reminded me that I used to do that with my daughter living in Brooklyn. My favorite thing to do with her was when we had like a day where I'm like, oh my God, how am I going to get through an entire day with this 3-year-old? We would get on a bus and we would just ride the bus around Brooklyn because there was so much to see. And then we would end up going to IKEA in Red Hook because, you know, I could dump her in the daycare for however long they would take her, sometimes like half an hour,
They have
sometimes an hour.
daycare at the IKEA?
Well, not daycare, but they had like a little kids center, right? Like a little ball pit and stuff.
IKEA really does it right.
Right. And so I could not, so we would like go there and eat for like $1. And then I could drop her off in the little kids center and I could just wander IKEA in a daze, until it was time for me, until my buzzer went off and I had to go collect her. But like,
Katie, you were describing my perfect day.
Right? Like, well, it's so funny because I had so much guilt around all of that, which was like, I'm not being present with her and I'm not sitting in the floor and doing all the things that parents are supposed to do. And so like so much of those moments, so much of this, I think, has been like reframing those strengths and just being like, oh no, that was like a fun day for all of us. Like that was, and it ate up like 8 hours, which was also great. So I would love to hear that.
It's amazing the space that you create when you stop shitting on yourself. You're like, oh, I have so much time. I have so much energy. I don't even have to be like encouraging myself, but just the absence of shitting on myself for everything is like, ooh, there's just a lightness. And I wish I knew like the key to that. I feel like when I have little, they're not even leaps, but like, baby steps in shitting on myself less throughout my life, I don't really know what does it. But I can feel like I felt that with my parenting recently, like, oh, there's just a little bit less like pressure on my chest about that. But that makes me so sad. Like I hear you going to IKEA. I'm like, you got it all figured out. I'm like, you're a genius. And you're just like, oh, what a negligent mother.
This was the best I could come up with.
I think it is brilliant. I do think that something that that has been consequential for me about an ADHD diagnosis has been like really leaning into the strengths. And it's not just like as a compensation or like a, trying to fight the negative thoughts. It's really been like its own separate, beautiful thing. And and it's identity stuff, like you mentioned. And a lot of it, I think I've learned from seeing the strengths of like other women with ADHD mirrored for me, either women I know or women kind of I see on social media or like I'm in, Facebook groups with. I have this like academic mothers with ADHD Facebook group that like makes me, is definitely like my safe place. And the strengths are like, I didn't have names for those either. So it's like, not just, I didn't have a name for how, bad I was at finishing something I started. It's like, I also didn't have a name for the fact that I always see connections, that like, I just constantly, I want to make connections between things and I don't stop until I can see the whole picture of something and how it's all related. And sometimes that gets me in trouble, right? Our listeners can think of scenarios, like when, someone's trying to have a linear conversation, or I'm a consultant in a job and they're like, no, just do your one piece. And I'm like, no, I need to know how the company works and all the organization flow. But my friend Courtney said to me once, she was like, do you think you like understand intersectionality better because of your ADHD? And I was like, why, thank you, Courtney, who is not ADHD. I was like, yeah, I do. So giving like that a name is so exciting. Or, even giving a name for like the adventurer, or I think about the like nomad role a lot. I don't know if you talked on this podcast about the Kenya study of ADHD. Do you know that one?
I know it from your essay, but and I know there's also the famous book, which I haven't read yet, about farmers and hunters.
Right.
But that same concept, right? Yeah. I
can't really read like nonfiction idea books. I just have to kind of have someone describe them to me.
You know what?
I'm like, give me the bullet points.
I was going to say, usually you could get the gist of a book from a 2-minute TikTok video, which is why TikTok is so awesome. Because you're like, you could get to the like core of the issue really quickly.
I'm a skimmer, so like I can read a novel. You can't skim a novel. But those books are hard for me, so I'm always behind. But yeah, it's a study. It was done like 15 years ago in a tribe called I don't know how to pronounce it, but I think the Arial in northern Kenya. And basically, it's like my favorite piece of research ever. This tribe was like very unique because at some point they were all hunter gatherers, and then at some point a section of the tribe broke off and became farmers, agrarians. And so they had these totally, genetically similar related groups that were living very different lives. And what they did is they looked for the genetic markers of ADHD, those DRD4 receptors or whatever they're called. And they found people in both versions of the tribe that met that genetic criteria for ADHD. And what they found was in the agrarian group, where they were all farmers, the ADHDers were, low status, they were undernourished, they were poor. But in the group that were still nomads, they were the most successful, most kind of well-regarded members of that group. And so these are kind of like the same genes having a very different, outcome in different environments. And that was really helpful with my work with kids, like really explaining to people and people who work with kids how much the environment matters, but also for myself and being like, oh, I'm a motherfucking nomad. I was trapped in the suburbs. No offense to our suburban listeners, but I am a city mouse, and I feel really good I can be dropped down into any city in the world, and I'm like, ooh, I got this. And the country's cool too. There's bird noises and stuff to keep me busy in the country. But suburbs are really hard for me. They're just, I don't really know how to get like the social energy that I really need to feel good and regulated. And monotony is hard for me. So I was trapped in the suburbs last month, and it was a lovely time, but for me, that kind of context was hard. And I spent a few days being a total jerk to everyone. And I was just like taking it all out on my husband. And then I was like, oh, this is hard for me. I'm a nomad in the suburbs. And I just have to do some combination of trying to be a little bit smart about it and figuring out like, what does a nomad in the suburbs do? Do they walk like along the big kind of stretch of highway to the Cold Stone Creamery and like get whatever they want and, listen to loud music while they do it? Or do I just accept that this is going to be hard and this isn't for me? So I use the nomad frame a lot.
I love that.
And again, I think of that as a strength. So that's something that I really discovered. I knew it cognitively before I thought I had ADHD, but I was applying it to other people.
I love that. And now the next time I walk by I drive by somebody who's walking along the side of the highway, I'll have a totally different point of view. I'll be like, yes, you go, brother.
You air drum to No Doubt. Like it's nobody's business. Yeah.
And I remember talking when I interviewed Casey Davis, who also, I don't know if you know her, she kind of rose to fame on TikTok with her account Domestic Bliss. She's a therapist who talks a lot about the moral neutrality of domestic life, right? And that we are not morally terrible people if we can't fold our laundry. And I remember saying to her, like, I was like, you were the first person who gave me permission to not want to do these things. I'm like, how sad is it that I live in this, that we live in this society where that voice is just not heard by women. And I was like, because I'm always on this podcast being like, is this ADHD or am I just an angry fucking feminist living in this country in this time period where I'm like, so many of us are getting diagnosed right now. And, also, like, I'm always questioning, like, is this a fake, epidemic? Are we being overdiagnosed? Is there something else? Is it just this confluence of like, we're finding out more about what this is in adult women, more women are kind of relating to this. And so it's just this, apex of information where we're all getting diagnosed, and this is great and wonderful. But there's always this part of me in the back of my mind that's like, I don't know. Maybe we're all just like, am I just part of the problem? And especially when people get diagnosed after listening to my podcast and they write me and they're like, thank you. I'm so glad, it's thanks to you that I got diagnosed. And I'm like, oh God, am I part of this like mass, hysteria?
Yeah, pathologizing women for not wanting to fold laundry. I don't mind putting the laundry in, by the way, but I will never see it through to completion.
Oh, I'm totally fine as long as I set a timer and I remember to put it in the dryer the same day, which is like a major win for me. Everything is great until the folding. The folding is just, that's it. I hit a wall, and I've talked about this in the past. Right. And I talked about this in the past on the podcast too with my teenage daughter, because she has to do her laundry now, and she has a dirty hamper and a clean hamper, and she refuses to fold her laundry. And I'm like, but you have to fold your laundry. And she's like, why? And I'm like, because it will be wrinkled. And she's like, I don't give a flying fuck if it's wrinkled. I don't buy, she's like, and she refuses to feel shame. Right. And so, I often think about that in terms of how I view her, where I'm like, you have the audacity to not feel shame around so many, self-care tasks and so many household chores, where I'm so envious of that ability, because I'm like, God, there's so many things that I don't do and just feel guilty about not doing them, when I should be saying, does this even need to be done? Or like you said, right? Yeah. Like, how do I outsource this? Because I don't got time for this.
Yeah, this is why I'm not worried about the youth. I think they, I know they're like addicted to screens, whatever. I mean, so are we, but they're going to be great. They're really figuring some stuff out. Yeah. I mean, the way that I fold laundry, it might as well be in a hamper. I mean, it is wrinkled no matter what. But I have started to give myself permission to just let go of some of that stuff. And I don't know what my husband would say about it, but I think we do a good job checking in about again, how can I have a strengths-based approach to domesticity of the things that I like to do are fun puzzles, around scheduling, to a certain extent, I do kind of enjoy that, or communication with my kids' friends' families. But I'm not going to return the paperwork. I don't fold the laundry really that much anymore at all, actually, now that I'm thinking about it. And it's kind of beautiful.
I just pull the clean clothes out of the pile, and that's to be folded in parentheses, because if I can wear the clothes fast enough, and then it just goes back in the laundry, and then the fold pile doesn't exist anymore. So I've just tried to minimize. See,
that's very enticing. It's a little dangerous for me. I also live in a small apartment with 4 people, so I do have friends, my friend Sarah, who I talked about, has a lot more space than I do, and I get a window into what my brain would do if it had a little more room, because I don't love clutter and stuff with all so I do have a threshold, but I think if I had more space, I would be doing some naughty things.
Well, I know, right?
My messes,
but it's true what you said. It's true what you said about organization. And I always find it interesting that TikTok, because, everybody on TikTok is neurodivergent, because we're like moths to a flame when it comes to social media like that, especially in those tiny little 2-minute videos. It makes sense that everybody hanging out there they're all neurodivergents. So it's funny to me, the little niche communities that are created out of that, right? So there's this whole spreadsheet porn element on TikTok where people love videos about Excel and learning about Excel. And you might be at first glance, you might be well, that's odd. But I'm like, no, it makes perfect sense that there's this whole subset of neurodivergents who are just oh yeah, show me how those codes work.
Totally. We all have our thing. No,
right,
no, I just want to watch TikTok videos of you walking around IKEA by yourself. That's that would be my porn, is a parent doing something weird that regulates them. Or me walking around the side of the highway in suburban Maryland.
Yeah, I love it. Now, so, okay, one question I love to ask everybody, and I have no answer myself, but if you could rename ADHD to something a little less complicated or confusing, would you call it something else?
Yeah, I feel like people are working on this, but whatever they come up with won't be as fun as what you talk about on your show. I love this question so much. I kind of really overthought it, and I really should just show you my my brainstorm someday. Because one of my favorite special activities that makes me feel regulated is if someone is trying to name a product or something, I will just go to town coming up with 40 ideas, and most of them are dumb, but they make me laugh. But so they didn't end up as funny as I thought. But, you know, I was thinking like the all or nothing neurotype. I was thinking about like the all or nothing, like, which applies to so many different situations, like energy, conversation, you know, work, that I really feel like that is something that a lot of us experience. And then I was thinking about like one more thing brain, like, you know, like one more thing in terms of like, I always have one more thing to say, just one more thing, or there's always like, you know, one more thing I missed. Like, and I've started to laugh about it, but like earlier this week, I went in to test a kid in my office. I haven't been in a while, and I was so good. I did such a good job, Katie, like slowing down. And I actually planned the night before. I like made a checklist that I actually went back and looked at. Did I have all the materials I needed? And of course, I don't have my own like, you know, equipment for this stuff because I'm kind of a serial denier and like moocher about what I need. So I'm always like, you know, hitting up somebody and being like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. I'll bring you wine. Can I use your thing? So I borrowed stuff from different people, but I like did it in time. It wasn't an emergency. And I was so proud of how thoughtful I had been turning a new page. And then I got into the office with this 9-year-old and I was like, I completely forgot the first test I gave this kid. I completely forgot the like material, the blocks that he needed to use to like show me he had, you know, spatial organization. Just totally. I forgot the like form that he needed to write on. And I was just like, how is it always one more thing? I really thought through this. I did my best. And like, my brain just wasn't planning the future like this. So yeah, one more thingsies.
Yeah, I love that. That reminds me of the few abysmal years I spent as a copy editor because I was a journalist for years and years. And it was really, one thing I loved about copy editing was headline writing. It was really fun. I worked at the Daily News for a while and it was like, they were so serious about their headlines that I would sometimes work on one headline for my entire shift, right? And I'd be like emailing my husband being like, what do you think of this pun? And he'd be like, yeah, no, that's terrible. Start again, you know, but it was like, I loved that part of it. But the copy editing was such a nightmare. I'm like, because it didn't matter how many, you know, no matter how many corrections you made, you'd always miss something, right? And that's the only thing anyone would see the next day. And I was like, this is like some sort of strange element, you know, level of hell that, you know, no matter how many problems you solve, you're going to miss something. And that's the only thing that's going to matter. And I was like, that is totally how my brain works. Like, it doesn't matter how many good things I do. I'm only going to think about the one bad thing I did.
Yeah, totally. Right. Or like the one thing that you need to complete something when you are hyper focused on it. I actually asked the librarian the other day to print out, this was very scary, the list of books that I owed. And I mean, it was like, you know, like if you get tickets at the arcade, like you want to just see the tickets keep coming out of the slot and you're like, yeah. This was like the opposite, where like the little receipt rolled out and it like kept rolling. Like it went through one little roll and then it scrolled again. And I was like, fuck. And so I like faced this list and I love our libraries. I was like, I gotta make it right with you all. And then I went home and I went like, you know, crazy trying to find all these library books. And I was watching my son and daughter read with my husband and he was like putting them to bed. And they were kind of having a kooky night. Like, I think they could have used my calm energy. And I kept being like, in a minute, when I find one more book, I'm going to go sit with them and I'll like rub somebody's back and, you know, I'll be like super engaged. And then I was like, wait a minute. I think I saw Star Wars, Revenge of the Sith, you know, Lego, whatever, on the upper shelf of this bookshelf. And then, so there's that hyper focus one more thing too.
Yeah, I like that. There's something about tangents too. I feel like that's one thing I've been much better at, which is like I can start to see a tangent happening, especially if I'm like talking to my husband or something or my kids, where I'm like, oh, just so you know, I'm about to go on a tangent. So this is like last exit before toll, right? Like if you're not up for this, we can just abort right now, but I'm just letting you know. And he's like, no, it's fine. I'm here for it.
I love the trigger warning or whatever. Yeah. I consulted for my work with this psychologist based in Kentucky. His name's Matt Lowry, and he's an autistic psychologist, and he assesses people for autism and ADHD, and he's brilliant. And he told me a few things. I was consulting about it on, autistic clients that I work with, but he taught me a lot about myself in this, consultation inadvertently. And he was talking about, he said, I'm sure whatever, there's gray areas to all of this, but he was like, autistics speak in tangents. Like we really go off into like a long, deep thing. Like, oh, you want to talk about birds? Let me talk to you about like all the birds. He's like, ADHDers speak in curlicues. And I was like, oh my God, Matt, you're killing me. This is what I do. I just go like here a little bit, here a little bit, here a little bit. And then I think later that night I met a friend of a friend at a bar who, my favorite kind of new person to meet, just like super fun and engaged and kind of messing with me a little bit. And at some point he was like, you're speaking in ellipses. And I was like, that's just how I talk, but nobody ever tells me the truth.
I remember somebody pointing that out on Twitter, that people with ADHD use a lot more, not only ellipses, but M dashes. And I was like, called out, where I was like, basically, that's how you can diagnose somebody, is how many M dashes they use in regular, like, paragraph, regular communication. I was like, oh, yeah, that's a total thing.
In my writing, I mean, I'm all about run-on sentences, and it's it would be bad, but I don't know. No one seems to complain very much. So I'm just going with it.
Well, and I always have a difficult time trying to come up with a headline or coming up with a title for these podcast episodes, because I'm like, what didn't we talk about? And so I'll settle on something, and then I'll have a little promo where I'm like, we talk about anxiety, and somebody will be like, oh, I'm super excited, I really want to listen to this episode about anxiety, and I'm like, we talk about it for like 10 seconds, but I have the hardest time trying to figure out what. I'm like, what do we even talk about? I don't know.
There's always one more thing. That's why, I mean, in my newsletter, my titles always have it's like this and this and this and this and this.
Beautiful segue. Thank you for that segue. So let's talk about your newsletter, how people can find more of your writing. I know you're quite a prolific writer and beyond your own Momspreading, but where can somebody find
Katie, you? I go through phases, man. I'm in a rut right now, and it's like I wouldn't even call it writer's block. I'm just like, I'm not feeling it. But then I will have prolific bouts. I write a Substack newsletter. It's called Momspreading. It's loosely about, parenting, just being a person, I think. And certainly we touch on ADHD because that's everywhere for me. I write for the parenting site Romper a lot and do other freelance work, but you can find a lot of my work on Romper. I also do consultation with families. I'm not really good enough to be like an adult ADHD coach, maybe someday, but I work with families trying to help figure out how to support their neurodivergent kids. And I have a website for that. It's sarahwheelerphd.com. And if there's any Bay Area listeners or listeners who are into stuff around public schools, I started a little organization last year called Get Schooled Oakland. And we have a website under that name where we're working to kind of get parents to choose a more diverse range of public schools in cities like Oakland.
Oh, awesome. Okay, well, I'll put links to all of that in the show notes.
That's my stuff.
That's.
And I always, I feel like, can I give an ADHD recommendation?
Yeah, absolutely.
Like, I just love, so I already told you, if anybody's made it this far from the beginning to my rantings, that I have trouble with nonfiction kind of books, and I really struggle with ADHD books. Like I want to learn, but there's the pathologizing vibe of some of them, but even the celebratory ones, I just want it to be an article. I can't deal with the fat. So it's always interesting to me that I'm like, I don't feel like this book was written for an ADHD person, or maybe it's just not written for me. But the like one ADHD book that helped me so much that I could totally read cover to cover is Joan Wilder's book, Help for Women with ADHD. And it's you could order it, like it's an Amazon book, so you can get it like straight to your Kindle for a few bucks. Or you can get a paperback, and it's just like short. The anecdotes really changed my life, like lots of recognition for me in her descriptions of different women's experiences. And then I like the strategies. So
that's amazing. Oh, that's really good to know, because I gave up reading. Along, a while ago. I listen almost exclusively. Sometimes I'll listen to a book where I'll be like, I need to own this, and then I'll buy it after listening to the audiobook. But it's funny because I'll listen to a lot of audiobooks, and I listen at like 1.5 speed, and I'm like, I love this, and I will, I'm like listening to them, and I'm like, this is so profound. Unfortunately, I'm not going to retain any of it, and I'll never remember it. But I can tell you if I liked the book or didn't like the book.
Absolutely. I can tell you, I think, whether or not I read it. I could definitely, if I remember I read it, I can tell you how I felt about it. Right. And then sometimes there's a few things. Yeah, I can't do audio. I just zone out. Or I start singing No Doubt in my head or whatever.
Yeah. Well, no, I have to be doing it while doing something else. So I'm like, there's certain activities that can anchor me, like driving or walking my dog, or like I can't just sit and listen to an audiobook. That's agonizing. But yeah.
Oh, God. No. Torture.
But once I gave up reading and started listening exclusively, I listen to like 3 books a week now. It's crazy. Like, I'm very excited about that.
A lot of ADHDers really love the 1.5 speed podcast or audiobook. Podcasts I can do because they end. But like I got into a good podcast recently, and then I realized there were like 2 more seasons, and I just got overwhelmed.
Yeah, I know. Well, I feel like that's
one that has a long story that that arcs over time. I was like, I can't wait that long to find out what happens.
Well, I know that's kind of what's happening with this podcast, where it's like I've been doing it long enough now where it's like people don't know where to start. And I'm like, that's for somebody with ADHD, having this many episodes is actually a detriment. So I'm like, what do I do in this situation?
They're all
my babies.
Bound, they're independent. That's nice. You can pick up and start anywhere.
Yes, I like that part of it too. Well, thank you so much for sitting down with me and letting me pick your brain a bit about your thoughts and your life and your diagnosis and everything in between. So thank you. I love your writing.
Thank you for having me, Katie. Thank you. And it's such a joy to talk to other people with similar brains, and just like to envision the listeners out there, just like our little crew of weirdos. It just feels so. It feels cozy. I don't have to pretend I'm not a kook.
Right?
So
oh, Jane.
That.
Oh, Jane. She's such a hot mess. Yeah, I love it too. It does feel like we speak a different language, right? I always say it feels like unbuttoning a too tight pair of jeans. That's what I feel like when I talk to other women, with neurodivergent women. So thank you so much, Sarah. It's been an absolute pleasure. And
thank you.